All right, welcome to the IBC ecosystem call for 11 July 2019. Thanks for coming. First off, for anyone here who hasn't been on an IBC call before, can you quickly introduce yourself for the benefit of the rest of the group and posterity? This is recorded and it will be posted on YouTube, just FYI, so don't utter your private key and hacks unless you want it to be stolen. Andrew, have you joined before? If you haven't, I've forgotten, I'm sorry, but...
Yeah, of course, I have to make apologies because it's a little bit noisy.
Cool.
I'll try to keep my mic turned off.
Vit or Vite?
Yeah, that's Vid. Hi, everyone. I'm in a cab right now, so I'm just going to be real quick with the Everstake. And yeah, I just was curious what this is all about. First time here, just to figure out.
Cool. Justin?
Hey, I'm with Althea, and we're working on starting a zone, and bridging IBC are all very important for that to be viable, so I figured I'd poke my head in.
Cool, thanks for joining. And Justin Drake, you want to briefly introduce yourself? Also, this is recorded, just FYI.
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Justin Drake. I'm part of the Ethereum Foundation and specifically doing research on Ethereum 2.0. And I guess I'm looking for opportunities for standardization with IBC and also looking to learn from the latest and greatest techniques for light clients and crushing communication.
Fantastic. So for those who are new, the usual format of these meetings is that we go over a few quick administrative status updates on status of IBC specifications, and then we talk about whatever people want to talk about, be that protocol details or potential applications or things that could be clarified. So I'll go ahead and go through the administrative updates, and June can talk a bit about the implementation progress, but then the floor is open. If you have agenda items, the document should be publicly writable, so please just add them to the bottom under agenda items. So a few updates on the IBC standardization. We are making good progress towards what we're going to call IBC 1.0, which is a milestone you can find on the ICS repository, so I will link that here. And IBC 1.0 will be feature complete. It will be what we deploy on, or what we propose for deployment, modular acceptance of the Cosmos Hub validators on the Cosmos Hub. And it will work in many chains.
Your audio just broke up.
We are features potentially slated for.
Your audio just broke up.
Oh no.
It will be feature complete and something. Just start all of that over.
Test. ABC 1, 2, 3. Okay. IBC 1.0 will be feature complete and hopefully used between the Cosmos Hub and zones. We already have a few features which are not slated for 1.0, but we might want to get in 1.1 or 1.5 or 2.0 TPD, particularly multi-hop routing and more complex packet ordering constraints. So you can find some discussions of those on issues on the ICS GitHub if you are interested in discussing them. ICS 5, which discussed the port allocation system. Ports are sort of names which we assign to modules or allow modules to bind to, and are the interface through which the IBC handler running on different blockchains requires that the host blockchain provide some kind of module-based permissioning so that only certain modules can own channels, send on channels, and they do that by binding to ports. ICS 5 has been finished and merged, but if you have any questions or comments, please leave them and we'll address them, even though it's merged, that's fine. I've also more or less finished up the updates to channel ordering acknowledgements and some simplifications to the channel closing handshake, which you can find in pull request 144 as alterations to the specification. And we quickly discussed, although I haven't done yet, probably will do next week, the changes required to interfaces to be future compatible with multi-hop routing. Basically, we're going to have it look like you're opening a multi-hop channel to end-to-end to another module. But in fact, only one hop will work for now until we add multi-hop support in the IBC handler. So hopefully, because we're adding it in the interface, that will be a 1.1 feature, not a 2.0 feature, because it will be easy to just add the additional functionality and support it. Do you want to talk a bit about the status of the SDK implementation, June, and what people might want to look at, what they should not yet play with, etc.?
Sure. So as you can see in the links, the most 2, 3, 4, and 23 are ready for review, and they have all the tests, they have all the testing sheets. You can definitely play with them. 2 also has the courier client functions, and are going to add it for the 3 and 4 in the near future, like a few days. Each of them has like some different structure with the normal keepers design pattern, because these are the sub part of the IBC module, which will have a keeper. So if it will be a bit hard to understand it the first time. So if there is anything you want to ask when you're playing with them, please ask.
Cool, thanks. We should probably set up some dedicated review time with the SDK team, maybe next week. I don't know what people's schedules are.
Chris, we've still got some folks out next week, so following week would probably be better.
Sounds good. Yeah, no rush. Cool. And we can help, or whatever would be best, however best. June and I can help with that, Jack. I'll also review the PRs myself, probably tomorrow. Cool. That's the end of the administrative updates. Any questions on those? Cool. Any questions in? Go ahead. Oh, maybe that was a mic brush. Not a question.
I have a topic, but I didn't put it on the agenda. It just came into my mind.
That's fine. I can put it on the agenda. What's your topic?
Could we talk a little bit about what a specification for an application level protocol should look like? We talked a little bit about me starting to work on the like the cross-chain validation spec, and in addition to the Tendermint wide client ADR, like I have 2 like specs to write on my well, I seem to just have lots of specs to write in my agenda to-do list, but I will get to them. But it would be great to like talk about on this call a little bit about like what something like that should look like, and maybe like think about like kind of like a structure and a format for such things.
That's a great question. I could envision 2 sorts of things it would contain. It would certainly contain the formats of the involved packets, so like data structures for the different kinds of IBC packets that would constitute such a protocol, like proving that some validator set had changed for interchain collateralization, sending a slash over a chain, those would all be packet types. Then it would also probably include some description or specification of the relevant state machine logic, which different chains would need to implement in order to have the same semantics associated with the packets. Like how in the case of interchain collateralization, how packets containing validator updates should be relayed through ABCI, and like when packets containing slashes should be generated, that sort of thing.
Okay, that sounds about right. That sounds like a little bit like what I was thinking. So we should let's try and get and like if anyone in the community wants to start contributing those as well, like we should start contributing different protocols.
Yeah, I think we probably want to go so far as to have exact packet encodings with a proto 3, for example.
Okay.
I guess that could vary based on the spec, but that way, the chains which speak a spec have to implement the same exact wire encoding at some point, and this seems to be more or less the place to put it.
Okay. Have we defined a wire encoding yet?
Well, the wire encoding for IBC and the wire encoding for packet data can be different.
Sure.
So IBC datagram should have a defined wire encoding, which no, we have not done that yet. So that's another good to-do item.
And I'm
What
sure
encoding
Latvia
is
by said that
the
they
current
can
prototype
actually
using?
Huh?
What encoding is the current prototype using? What
In the
wire?
implementation?
Yeah.
We are just using the codec.
So we probably don't want to use that.
So we don't. Yeah, we probably don't. want to use
unless
that. We've largely agreed.
I don't know what the state.
So Ishmael has almost wrapped up the last of the work to make Amino fully proto compatible over the wire. So like let's just make this proto. Captain proto if Dean has his way.
But
I think we are using the human readable wire format for the keys, like the index or strings, where all the like a hex byte, where all of them are like a human readable and they form the key string. Are we also want to make the values like strings or uint64 to make it human readable for the values too, in a wire encoded format?
Who are you asking?
I don't think the IBC packet data needs to be human readable. It's pretty important that it be compact. I mean, we still can have it be the case that the things people have to actually sign over, like the SDK does, are JSON or something, but the packet data should be compact binary.
We've often found that early in development, texty verbose protocol is useful, and later on you want to switch to a binary after more than one client has validated that they're speaking the same language.
If we're using the codec pattern, we could encode JSON. We could have like multiple options, and that would be actually really nice for testing. Chris, great idea.
That's a great idea.
I think it's nice to provide a protobuf format, and then you can encode it in JSON or in binary either way, but at least it's specified from the day one.
Do you also have version encoding in it? I remember originally, I think it did not have version information.
The packets themselves don't have a version number, but if we use Proto 3, we could put a version number in them.
I wouldn't expect a version in each packet, just at some initial level of connection.
I was going to say the initial negotiation for protocol should, and you definitely want some initial negotiation for protocol, but after that you don't have to put anything in.
Does that mean that
the channel opening can contain a version?
Does that mean if a relayer comes along and tries to pick up halfway through, it has to crawl back to the very opening packet to discover how to parse everything else?
I think actually is adding one small integer field on every packet, saying what version it is, makes sense. Most APIs do that.
Yeah, for connection-oriented protocols over a wire where it's not possible to see data without having seen everything before, then a version number at the very beginning, there's still a place to keep it around. When you have something where every packet showing up is sort of a new event, more inclined to have an integer on each one.
Fair enough.
I think the version could be stored along with the channel. So the relayer doesn't need to crawl back. They just need to look it up.
Okay.
And then they would be able to parse particular data formats or whatever. I think we already support that, but I'll double check. Hamad, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you want to introduce yourself? Thanks for joining.
Hi, I'm Hamad. I'm a Binance fellow, and I'm working on a BEP, Binance Evolution Proposal for Binance, for implementing IBC. I've been in this email working group. Like, I joined meeting once before as well, but I just started looking into the code and specs again, so that we can do the BEP. Yeah.
Any questions so far?
No, not so far. I will ask once I have.
Sounds good.
Thank you for joining, Hamad.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, so it sounds like a specific actionable there is to add Proto 3 schema files to all of the ICS specs, which currently require specific datagrams. And that should happen before 1.0. Would that cover what you want, Ethan Fry?
Yes, I think just having a simple number on them is great. There's a type field already for every datagram, right? Or is it dependent just on the port module? Knows the type?
There is not a type field. As an application, you could choose to encode a type field in your datagrams, but there's no type-based routing. The routing is module-based.
Okay, cool. And inside the module, it can be anything it wants to be. So if it defines multiple, so if a module supports one type of message, it just has a version message. If it supports multiple types, it'll have those as well, right?
That's right. So the module can choose to further multiplex. Although, depending on what it's doing, it would also be fine to find multiple channels. There's no like additional amortized overhead. So.
Very nice. I like the port idea. I read that today, and it seems to be a brilliant idea.
Cool. Next on anything else to discuss regarding coding or versioning or application specs? Do you think, Zaki, that June and I should write the application spec for token transfers, fungible token transfers?
I think that would be great in the sense that it would provide an example for everyone else.
That sounds good.
It's kind of like ideally token transfers should be very simple. It's like
there's also the NFT group that Tech put together, Telegram group, to talk about it, about NFT transfers for Cosmos, etc. Do you happen to know if they're doing IBC format for that? Well, there was also the IBC format for NFTs, right?
Yeah. So, Dean, I just met with them yesterday. They're primarily focused on the on-chain representations right now, and then I think we can move to IBC in a bit. Setting up some time with them and Billy from our side, who's working on the NFT IBC spec. So once we have the sort of outline and sort of like the standard format of IBC application spec, then I think the NFT one will follow soon after the token transfer.
Cool.
Like it's going to be substantially similar because I think the current design we're going with, NFTs don't carry their metadata with them. They're just an identifier, chain ID, and like just the bare bones. Anyway, sorry.
No, this is actually an interesting conversation. Can you go in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, for sure. So talking to Billy over the period of the last like month or two, on the big question with NFTs is over metadata. So right now, the way it works on Ethereum is there's just a one field that's very short where you can put a URL to go resolve the metadata. So it's essentially just a pointer to the metadata. Billy's wondering whether or not to continue with that approach or allow an option for folks to stick that metadata on chain. But either way, the ability to update that metadata shouldn't transfer with the token. It should live with the zone. And the metadata for those NFTs is going to be closely associated with that zone no matter what. So the idea that he has is that when you're transferring NFTs over IBC, you would only transfer the ID and the denomination realistically, and then you know where the origin chain is, so you can always go back and query the origin chain for the metadata if you want. So that's the current thinking on the NFT IBC spec.
Cool. One thought I've had for a long time on that is potentially being able to, and this doesn't need to be in the MVP, but like potentially having some notion of like a whitelist of multiple zones that are allowed to mutate the metadata. So like instead of saying just transfer the ID, you could transfer the metadata along with a whitelist of zones that are allowed to mutate that metadata, and potentially the hub could enforce the rule that only changes to that metadata that has originated in another, like on a whitelisted chain, are allowed to update that metadata.
Well, I think that the way that in this, I might be wrong on this current implementation, but the way it's working now, the only people who are able to update the metadata are the folks who do the issuance. So that's controlled by NFT issuance, which is one zone specifically. Like you could pass those rights over to another zone as well via a whitelist. I'd be interested to know what you're thinking as far as use cases there.
There's definitely financial instrument use cases to this. Is sort of like where my head is at in terms of like DeFi use cases, where we're like, okay, like we've decided, like, you know, like this chain is able to like, but it's like also this question of like, you know, could you like, so this comes back to like the breeding crypto kitties example. Like in the issuer is the only one allowed to mutate metadata mechanism. You have to return the NFT to its issuing zone in order to breed two crypto kitties. But in the whitelist model, you could say that like these whitelisted zones are also allowed to breed crypto kitties.
That's interesting. You know, the more that I learn about the NFT space, there's kind of what's really driving it right now is gaming. And there's a ton of folks very interested and very active in that community. Financial NFTs, like the staking derivatives that you and Mayor have been talking about a bunch lately, I have a feeling we're going to want some different spec for those. And I don't know if the same NFT spec is going to work as well for gaming assets as it will for financial assets. But that's just my initial thought on it.
What different kinds of fields would you want for financial versus other kinds of tokens?
Actually, yes. I just want to say that like you can actually encode any kind of information inside the current NFT specification. Yeah. So basically, like you can just agree on a certain schema for any financial asset and just go on with that.
Yeah, but probably the combination logic or the analogous logic to breeding in cryptocurrencies with financial assets, like exercising an option, is going to be pretty specific.
Yeah, Chris, that's kind of my thought, is like, because these things are going to hold so much more value and are going to be less generalizable, my feeling is that, yeah, while you can shove any data in that metadata field in NFTs, like use cases like what Zaki's talking about, the ability for other zones to update them and stuff, I have a feeling we end up with a few different implementations here. But let's try to converge on a spec that works for everyone. Working with the Binance folks on that as well.
So I have a question here. The way I'm interpreting Zaki's proposal is, so if there's a staking derivative, right, it's issued on the hub, and the derivative is such that it can flow to a different zone, and then in that derivative, let's say you can like change withdrawal address. NFT can go somewhere, and then you can change a withdrawal address, and then somehow it changes the place where the rewards go. So this kind of whitelist idea would mean that there are certain zones that are able to affect the change in the withdrawal address of the NFT, but other chains can't. But how do you decide on the whitelist? Who makes the whitelist?
The NFT issuer would generally create that, right, Zaki?
The issuer, yeah.
But in the staking derivative case, the issuer is the hub protocol. There is no.
Yes, that is not necessarily the use case that I had in mind for something like this. I'd have to probably think a little bit more to precisely spell out my use cases. I've sort of been thinking about this in terms of sort of very abstract CryptoKitties type things for a long time, but I haven't really thought about them in context of a specific NFT like a derivative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so if the question here might be that if there's a whitelist, let's say 10 zones can make an update to the NFT, you could get into a situation where there are compound updates. So NFT, let's say NFT started at state 0 in the origin chain, and then went through a bunch of updates on different chain. So some chain receives state 10, but then that state 10 is dependent on the updates executed by a bunch of different zones, each of which have different security. So the state 10 NFT receiving chain may be very unsure of whether to believe that state of the metadata in that NFT. It's an IBC transitivity problem, right? That's why multi-hop routing, the more the number of hops, the end destination is less surer of the original data.
Yeah,
Same
so
could happen with that.
This is sort of conceptualizing this as in a small radius around a hub, or around an issuing zone of a small number of hubs. The issuing zone is aware of other chains that are considered by it to be reliable enough in their statement, in their enforcement of various rules, that it will accept mutations on the state. Because the IBC security model is the issuing zone can always sort of invalidate everything as a matter of principle. An issuing zone can just choose to effectively debase or ignore or whatever a token at any point in time, just because that's the nature of sovereignty. And so the question, this is more like a contract between the issuing zone and some set of trust paths, that it says these trust paths, we promise to respect mutations that they make to this object that we have issued.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, isn't this something where we could allow cross-chain contract calls to the NFT contract on the originating chain and avoid this whitelist scenario?
As in where the owner of the NFT on the new chain would prove that they own it on the new chain, relay that proof to the original chain, and yeah, it seems possible.
Might make for a conceptually simpler system that achieves the same goals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would think something would work like that for us anyway. For distributed smart contract stuff, there's not necessarily any particular thing which is unique to the issuing chain other than its original control.
Well, but for our payment stuff, the purse has to go back to the issuer to be exchanged for the new exclusively owned purse.
Yes, okay, fair enough.
So I think we've got a similar thing where the issuing chain is pretty special, and a lot of things for them to become authoritative have to go back there.
So the way sort of, if you want to map that a little bit to like the Cosmos Hub context, the like Cosmos design context, it's like in a world where many things are issuing purses, and what we sort of think is that like you would want to have like a hub type object where like the delegation of like taking a purse and issuing a new uniquely controlled purse is sort of by convention delegated all to like this one hub zone, even though like original issuers of assets are somewhere else. Because like issuers of purses and issuers of the assets within those purses can potentially be separated. And that's sort of how how I would think would like fit well into the public blockchain sort of world.
Yeah, we kind of need a thing where there's the authoritative source, and then there's the somewhat less authoritative source. And as a user of that, you can figure out what the relationship is, and that you might be willing to, get a shorter round trip time or shorter exchange time by working with your local less authoritative version.
Mm-hmm. Well, it all sounds pretty interesting. Maybe we should write some of it up on the NFT ICS issue. I took notes.
Fair enough.
Good notes, Chris. Thank you.
Cool. Next question on the agenda: dates and full review of 1.0 timing by D.
Yes, I was noting that I have a challenge reading the deltas. So I'll understand the discussion, then I go back and try and figure out through Markdown what the document delta actually is. And yeah, there's ways of figuring that out. But at some point, once it settles to here's what we think 1.0 is, I think that there is a non-trivial value in having, like we did in Berlin, but now a end-to-end 1.0 spec review where you see it and load it all in your head at one time. And this is what 1.0 is, and get, and that could be a Zoom thing. I mean, that could be a web thing, but it would be distinct from an agenda. It's now we're just going through that specification to think about what's actually there, not what do we think outside that might apply to what's there. And I think that would be useful. That is a useful precursor, certainly, to any security review. And so that's something where, that backs out to me of when, you had said earlier, when do you think 1.0 will be, specification will be gelled, but that includes, the binary protocol and those kinds of things. So first off, do you find that a useful idea? And if so, what's the time frame at which we should think about scheduling that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea.
That sounds like you
I
might
think
want to
we should do it after the.
You totally froze when you were about to say a date.
No,
sorry,
what did
Chris.
you say, Jack?
I was going to say that sounds like a fantastic idea. That sounds like 3 or 4 sessions over the course of a week or two, and we could break each of the ICSs up. We could break it up into like 2 or 3 ICSs per fall. Like, I would love to do that. I think taping that and inviting a lot of participants who are outside to watch would be interesting as well. But as far as dates, Chris, let me defer to you on that one. Sorry.
Yes, I would second everything Jack just said. I think it's next. No.
Good here.
Test.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm out in rural Germany, so the internet's a bit sketch. But I think it would make sense to start that process after we've done at least a little bit of an internal review on June's implementation, insofar as that pertains to the specs, understandability of the specs. June's already provided some good feedback and an issue on the ICS repository. And I also want to talk to some SDK developers who have not been enmeshed in the IBC process and make sure everything makes sense to them. So I guess that will happen in 2 weeks. So I would say 3 weeks from now is the time to start this.
Dean, your lips
I
are
think I
moving,
can
but we're
do
not hearing
June
you.
and I.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes. I know you said earlier, but what's your estimate of when you think the 1.0 spec is done?
I think we could start this in-depth review in 3 weeks after the SDK PRs see a first round of review. So that would be basically and last week of July or the first week of August that's actually in 3 weeks. Let me check.
You were targeting last week of July for 1.0 spec
Yeah.
done, so that's nice.
That's 1 week.
Yep.
It's the week 29th. Yeah, it's
I'm
about
feeling really
in line
good
with
about
what we
the-
talked about
I'm feeling
previously.
really good about the
And I still
week.
think we're on track.
You feel really good about
So
what?
last week of July is the answer to your question.
Excellent.
And that's a good hard date, so very motivating. So I'm not sure we'll want to declare it 1.0. I'm a little hesitant, but we can declare it like pre 1.0 review. And
the
then
week of
after a few
29th?
in-depth sessions.
Release candidate
Yes,
one.
that's the week of July 29th.
You can attach infinite numbers of release candidates.
Yes, 1.0-RC0. See 1.0-RC0 spec and 1.0-RC0 implementation. Then that means that we should be able to have a bit of internal review prior on both spec and implementation side. It is also my plan to convert the set of specs on IBC 1.0 once we agree to it into paper format as a sort of snapshot of the state of the protocol and circulate that to a few academics who've expressed interest in analyzing IBC and working on it. Helpful to get their opinions too. And there's some, maybe some prior precedent and TCP IP stack design, distributed systems. So. Cool. Any further questions on that topic? Next item. Does anyone know about Facebook's plans for Libra IBC integration? By Chris H. Do you want to further explicate?
We were looking at the Libra stuff recently, and I think I've seen stuff in a couple of places mentioning that they're thinking about IBC, but I wonder whether they've talked to anybody or whether anybody's heard anything.
I've been talking to them about things unrelated to IBC. The Libra system design is essentially like an alt Tendermint architecture. It's like very, very, very similar to Tendermint.
Yeah, that's what it looked like.
And to the extent that they have like a thing that's almost exactly like ABCI in it, where you can swap out the execution VM. And I've been looking at what it would take to swap out, to integrate the Cosmos SDK into Libra, which seems like a surprisingly doable thing.
Someone's keyboard mic is live and it's off the typing.
That's Chris.
Sorry.
So yeah, I mean, there would be nothing that like implementing IBC on top of Libra and Move seems to be very doable. I don't know whether or not anyone on their team has been looking at it.
Okay.
Yeah. It seems to be quite chaotic over there. They seem to be adapting to having like divided themselves up now into like multiple entities and become somewhat decentralized. And like that decentralization, like as you know from interacting with people like us, when you have multiple decentralized organizations, they all work on different things and they all have different views on the world, and like you need to run Tendermint to come to consensus.
From the outside, it probably looks like for Facebook that's a new feeling, but I'll bet that like lots of other big companies, there are already multiple separate fiefdoms that communicate loosely.
Yeah, I just think inside this project.
Yeah.
My impression is that they have started to become significantly more decentralized internally, and so That's my impression from talking.
We're interested because from a cursory look at the docs they've got so far, it looks like they've got interesting representation of resources, and the agoric ERTP layer would be a great way to manage trades among resources. It doesn't look like it's a great place to manage cross-resource trading, but maybe somebody will figure out a way.
Yes, I note that the other element that we should say is that their security model, sadly, is message.sender style security for the most part. So they have much of the same problem that we otherwise want to solve. So
yeah, I think move is interesting. It seems very early. So I was like, this is why why I think the idea of sticking the Cosmos SDK on top of Libra is kind of interesting and exciting.
Yeah, I mean, there seem to be a lot of distinct paths here, some of which are more about connecting the technology stacks, was in our hands at least, and others would be like about connecting the specific instantiation of Libra, which Facebook is setting up a consortium to run or whatever, which could also be interesting. But I suspect that will be more up to them than us. I don't know. What do you think, Saki?
Yeah.
It would be great to have ABCI hot stuff.
Yeah. So there's going to be, so the plan with them is to get this charter signed and then stand up a like technical advisory board or something along those lines from the Libra community that would then be in a better position to start engaging with people like us on these questions.
And people could transfer all of their Fed coin or Facebook coin, Zuckbucks, off of Libra and shield them on Zcash, and Facebook's plot would be foiled. It's my theory, anyways. Probably won't work that way. One could dream.
Yeah. I mean, I think the particular form of permissionlessness that exists within IBC might be quite appealing to them if we can explain it to them in a way that they understand.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I think we're at the end of the official agenda. I want to talk a bit more about the 1.0 full review. So what would be best for people? We could set up a sequence of Zoom calls where we discuss individual ICSs. I can like write up a review guide as a document that says, start here, read this, 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 you know, double check by answering this quiz question. Any preferences? Are people down for interactive sessions that would be recorded?
A review guide would certainly be of value.
Okay.
Interactive sessions that are recorded certainly seems good.
Like as an outsider, so I haven't been part of the IBC meetings between KIB and Agoric. As an outsider, I feel confused about what are the steps for the execution of IBC. Like some like flowchart that, hey, this is what we want to do and this is where we are at. Something like that would be nice.
Sorry, are you talking about development-wise or like in the protocol, what happens?
Yeah, all of this like spec, development. I'm not sure how the work is flowing in totality.
I think that's very simple to explain here. Like, so we are completing a specification process at the end of July that details all of the low-level packet flows, concepts, and abstractions. Now, what all of this does is sets up an infrastructure by which two blockchains can exchange information. And then June is working on implementation of that flow in the Cosmos SDK, for which there are work in progress pull requests that are open right now, that we will probably have an insecure version of, which does not do Tendermint-like client and state verification first, and then we will have a secure version of it after. There will be test nets for all these things, and then there will be application layer protocols, which we're discussing specifying for things like token transfers, NFT transfers, cross-chain validation, and then those protocols should be essentially implemented in Cosmos SDK modules that will then be able to invoke the IBC module, and then we will have a complete system.
Yep. June, you wrote a light client, right?
I wouldn't say it is a light. It is a light client, but like incremental version. So there's no bisection. You only increment from like 800 to 803.
Is that in your pull request?
It is in the pull request for ICS2, yes.
Okay, I will. I'll add that to the light client work that I've been doing for Tendermint.
And in respect to
the software we have to write is remember that and we should have talked about this earlier, but like the relayer has been coming up a lot in the last week, and we should be taught. I think we decided that we would have a new repo for the relayer.
I would like to talk about that for a moment. Yes.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, Dean, do you want to go first? Or?
Yes. So the only thing I wanted to bring up, so we were doing our engineering planning of sort of now that we were at testnet, how are we getting on the way to mainnet? Where's IBC implementation work, et cetera? And one of the observations is, our primary close to IBC thing is initially chain to individual machine, which it turns out looks an awful lot like exactly what you want to do with a relayer. So our solo machines that are that are acting on behalf of the client and sending messages into the system and responding to messages and all that sort of stuff, they've got they're signing messages to inject, and they're looking at the chain and following the chain and figuring out when there are messages for them and so forth. So they're almost all relayer plus our execution engine.
At least in one of the directions, right? The chain down to the solo node looks just like what the relayer is following. Relayer back up looks a little bit different. That's submitting new transactions, not ones that are coming from some other chain.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's submitting transactions essentially on its own behalf. One could imagine, making that look more or less like what the relayer needs. So, that having been said, that means that will for us be the first, implementation side of IBC will look like that. And so I just wanted to coordinate with what other relayer stuff was in progress.
My understanding of the solo machine case is it would be running a compatible chain and still be emitting proofs, in that you could just use the exact same relayer spec for that. Am I thinking about that wrong?
It's not generating blocks. It has a signing key, and it's the signing key that's the source of the authority for stuff being sent in to the swing set module inside the target chain.
All right, thank you for clarifying there, Brian. I appreciate that.
For example, right now it's invoking the Cosmos SDK message submission command, right?
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, we're doing everything through those helpers.
I was just thinking in the naive case, like I spin up a single node Tendermint chain, and then I can. Yeah, but
yeah.
Something a little bit more.
We had a diagram back at the hackathon that's kind of this square. It's like chain, solo. And so it's like, chain to chain is IBC. Chain to solo is basically IBC. The solo node is following along. It's checking the proofs. It's checking the block headers. Solo to solo is something like TLS. Solo sending into a chain, that looks like a regular transaction that's being addressed to the swing set module that's inside there.
Cool. As far as my thoughts on relayers, I'm trying to think of like, I guess there's this more kind of like industrial relayer where it maintains light clients for a number of chains and is able to accept arbitrary messages from all those chains. That's probably going to be run on a server somewhere, and that's going to have some very specific performance needs and characteristics. Pretty easy to construct that with existing. Oh, thank you, Dean. That's I think being able to construct that with the existing Golang libraries, especially once we merge the Tendermint light client work that Zaki and now Anton has picked up, will be fairly easy. That's something that I want to look at. But we also need to keep in mind that there will be sort of these like more ephemeral relayers where like somebody would set one up in a browser. So I think doing a JavaScript implementation in parallel with Jordan on that is something I'm very interested in. And I think as part of that, we should try to make the relayer spec as implementation ready as possible, like i.e. one document that somebody can read through and understand deeply the whole flow. Because we'll see a lot of these relayer implementations in different languages with different client server sort of characteristics, like i.e. that Golang one that I'm talking about is more server to server. And then the JavaScript one is like client to server, and then like maybe client to client in this kind of solo node configuration. So anyway, just kind of my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the part of that which doesn't exist at the moment is the exact store keys, which need to be read and scanned by the relayer, and it would be good to standardize that for the sake of implementers' ease.
June just opened a PR on the SDK to request, I guess, like a map or a guide to the store, out of the store. Like the store would, I'm using the same word over and over again, this is bad. The store itself would hold a copy of like how to get to different places in the store at a standardized key.
Yes.
That's exactly what you're talking about in that issue, correct, Jim?
You're muted.
Say that again?
I was saying I'm representing this issue that you opened correctly in what your thinking was there, correct? Awesome. So yeah, that's my current thinking on that.
Cool. Justin Drake, you asked a question about is there an executable spec? I don't know quite what definition of that term. So currently there is pseudocode in the specification. The pseudocode is written in TypeScript. Syntactic, which is a bit, I mean, maybe you could verify it in a theorem prover, but you can't execute it. We could have parts of the spec be executable, but it wouldn't in and of itself prove properties. You want to talk maybe more about what you're looking for or what you've used in the past?
Yeah, I guess initially I just wanted to gauge like the complexity of the thing and try and read through the spec. I mean, I haven't read through the spec yet. I guess I need to do that first. One of the advantages of having an executable spec is that you can write unit tests for it. Another advantage that you have is if you have two executable specs, is that you can do compliance testing with differential fuzzing. So this is the kind of infrastructure that we have, for example, for the Ethereum 2.0 spec.
And do you write executable specs then in like separate languages, if you have two of them?
Yeah, so we have one spec in Python and we have one spec in Go. And basically what we spec'd out specifically is a state machine. So we have a state transition function, and we make sure, for example, with the differential fuzzing, that if you start with the same state and you input the same block, then you get the same output state.
I see. So we plan to do differential fuzzing, but just with different reference implementations as opposed to with the spec, I guess, itself. Maybe the spec could end up containing a reference implementation, and then two reference implementations could, in that sense, be two specs.
So did I answer correctly that at the moment there's one reference implementation?
At the moment, there is an in-progress reference implementation, not yet 1.0, but in Go.
Okay.
And it should be possible to do that kind of differential fuzzing. You just need the reference implementations to like dump the store or dump a hash to the store. And then you could check that they got to the same state.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that mention of fuzzing, because that was something else. All right, let me add it to the list.
Separately from that, we could have the actual specs be executable. It would not be that hard. I could consider that. The link to the Go client is at the top of the document. So currently it's split up across a sequence of PRs in the Cosmos SDK. So it's not yet maybe in the easiest form to just review, but it will be soon.
So with respect to fuzzing, since that's now up, that also came up in our planning stuff. So is there a plan for automated fuzzing already? And if so, there should be of the implementation. And similarly providing test profiles, that sort of thing.
We plan to do it, but there are no more specifics. I was thinking, we did discuss it a bit. I was thinking we could write test vectors in JSON and then have language shims that work with the different implementations. The JSON test vectors would have start states, end states, datagrams being relayed, and they could then be used with the language shim. So we could share the test vectors, but easily test language implementations in different languages.
So Dean, in our discussion, you or someone mentioned some code-based.
Yes, I specifically mentioned Cluster Fuzz, which is one of the, I think it's Google's, but one of the engines out there for open source automation, CI automation testing of a system. You build your fuzz testing infrastructure in using a particular existing open source fuzz testing architecture, and then it'll do automated testing every time there's a check-in kind of thing. And that seems, having large-scale testing like that with standard open source infrastructure seems like the right way to go.
The part that was interesting to me is it sounded like Cluster Fuzz has some support for specifying the shape of the protocol and the states of the endpoints, which makes it possible for the fuzzing to be a lot more context dependent, which, if you've got a protocol that's at all self-defensive, if it's not context dependent, there's no way it's going to give you useful information.
Yeah.
It's pointing at libfuzzer and AFL, the American Fuzzy Lop fuzzer, which has been around for a while. It's a tool for taking 1,000 of those and pointing at the same thing.
Yep.
Yeah, that could be a good choice. I'll take note.
We fully intend to use what you produce. No, we will help.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think specifically after IBC 1.0, after those calls in the last week of July and after the implementation has been reviewed by the SDK team, June and I will spend a bit of time writing spec test vectors. So those will exist as a product of the spec process, but can also be contributed to via PRs, et cetera.
We're on the hotel.
Cool. We are a few minutes over. Any final questions? Then thank you all. See you in 2 weeks.
This was a really good call, guys.